ओके भाई लोग, तो पैट्रिक एच विलियम्स ने RRR के ऊपर एक वीडियो बनाई हुई है जिसको देखने के लिए मैं पर्सनली एक्साइटेड हूँ, क्योंकि इस बंदे को मैं सालों से देखते हुए आ रहा हूँ और इससे मैंने बहुत कुछ सीखा है। और जब मैंने देखा कि भाई इसने इंडियन सिनेमा के ऊपर वीडियो बनाई तो भाई मैं रोक नहीं सका कि भाई इस बंदे की वीडियो पे एक तो रिएक्शन बनता है। 32 मिनट का है, आई थिंक मेरा वन ऑफ द लॉन्गेस्ट रिएक्शंस में से एक होगा और मैं देखना चाहता हूँ। एक्चुअली मुझे वीडियो शुरू ही होती है, एक तो डिस्क्लेमर दिया हुआ है, दिस टाइटल is referring to Western audiences. The majority of this channel's viewers, obviously Indian audiences, are very familiar with the movie. Okay, अपने सामाजिक मापदंडों के हिसाब से टाइटल सजेस्ट किए हुए हैं, क्योंकि भाई बेचना भी तो है माल। बिना किसी देरी के ऐसे चालू करते मैं देखना चाहता है। मम्मी का फोन चालू। ऐसे पता है क्यों बोलना पड़ता है? क्योंकि कभी कभार वो सिंक नहीं हो पाता, तो चालू को वहां से मैं डाल देता हूँ तो वीडियो आराम से आ जाती है। ओके चलो, स्पॉन्सरशिप्स।
Well, I released my video about the best of 2021. The Oscars happened in a totally chill and unremarkable way, and so now, in April, it's finally time to talk about 2022. And you know what? It's been a pretty good year for movies so far. Everyone is rightfully going crazy for Everything Everywhere All at Once. After Yang is incredible. Michael Bay released his best movie in a decade. Channing Tatum finally returned after a 5-year absence. Emo Batman rules. Soderbergh knocked another one out of the park. We got an awesome Pixar movie, the first Adrian Lyne movie in 20 years, and it is fun as hell. Plus, more romantic comedies, which is always a good thing. And most importantly, America finally met Dr. Michael Morbius. But I'm not here to talk about any of those movies, because out of all the good movies this year, to me, one reigns supreme, delivering truly the best time I have had in a movie theater in years. And despite this movie being a massive international sensation and one of the biggest blockbusters of the 21st century, there is a good chance that you've never heard of it. The movie is called, and I promise this is literally the title, RRR, which stands for Rise, Roar, Revolt. There's actually more to the story of the title, but we'll get into that later. This is the new film from director S.S. Rajamouli, starring N.T. Ramarao Jr., Junior NTR for short, and Ram Charan. It is an Indian movie, but, and this part is very important, it is not a Bollywood movie. It is a 3-hour-long action musical historical epic, and folks, it is incredible. I have seen it 3 times in theaters. I've dragged almost all my friends here in the city to see it. Last weekend, I spent half an hour shouting at my sister on the phone about how great it is. The soundtrack is all I listen to. I'm obsessed.
भाई यार बंदा एडमायर कर रहा है, मैं मेरे को खुद पसंद आई थी।
While plenty of subtitled international films cross over to American audiences each year, whether they are awards contenders like The Worst Person in the World or genre favorites like The Raid, it rarely seems to happen with Indian movies. We as Westerners tend to go, oh yeah, Indian movies are all those crazy long musicals, but we rarely actually watch them. And I will be the first to admit that I really do not have much experience with Indian cinema. But whether you do or not, RRR is something you should know about and watch for 2 reasons. 1, it is genuinely a major event in modern international cinema. And 2, it absolutely rules. Like, this movie goes so hard. It is so fucking good that if you are able to see it and you choose not to, you are actively making the choice to live a worse life.
Find it!
Let's talk about Indian cinema. Now, I will be the first to admit that I'm not exactly an expert. In fact, I barely knew anything about it until yesterday, because thankfully, my good friend Siddhant Adlaka is literally from India and agreed to co-write this video with me and explain all the stuff that I didn't know. If you're on Twitter, especially American film Twitter, you may sometimes see people sharing clips of ridiculous over-the-top Indian action scenes with captions.
ये उतना बुरा भी नहीं था यार, I mean yes.
But here's the thing.
Rajnikant is Rajnikant.
That's often not the case. You see, all Bollywood movies are Indian, but not all Indian movies are Bollywood. Bollywood is the name of the Hindi language studio industry based in Mumbai, formerly known as Bombay, which is how Bollywood got its name. In fact, Bollywood movies only account for about 1/5 of the nearly 2,000 Indian movies produced each year. For a long time, Bollywood was the Indian mainstream. And while other parts of India have always had movie industries in their own languages, like Bengali cinema and the works of Satyajit Ray, plus a few dozen other regional language industries that I'm not yet familiar with, Bollywood was what people in the rest of the world, people like me, generally saw as modern Indian cinema. And while it's still really huge in India, its dominance has kind of shifted in recent years, thanks to blockbusters in industries in the south of India, in languages like Tamil, Telugu, and Kannada. In the past decade, Rajamouli's Bahubali films became some of the biggest Indian films of all time, and they were actually shot in both Tamil and Telugu simultaneously. As in, they shot every dialogue scene twice, once in each language. Since RRR is from the Telugu language industry, it is a Tollywood movie, which is not to be confused with the Bengali film industry, which is also called Tollywood because it's based in a region called Tollygunj. And India also has, buckle up, Mollywood, Bollywood, Collywood, Jollywood, Chollywood, and Sandalwood, but look, we don't have the time to get into all of that. The point is, in the last few years, Tollywood, the Telugu one, has emerged as the most financially successful Indian film industry. RRR has only been in theaters for a month, and it's already the second highest grossing film of all time in India, behind Rajamouli's Bahubali 2, and the third highest grossing Indian film worldwide. So why don't we know that much about Tollywood? To be fair, we don't talk about Indian movies that much at all. And when we do, it's definitely not like the independent art house stuff, which Siddhant assures me is great too. But you would think that even something as big as Bollywood, and now Tollywood, would be a little more on our day-to-day radar as people who like to watch and talk about movies. But hey, it's not too late to change that, and RRR is a great place to start. Now, if you only have a passing knowledge of Bollywood, maybe through the one Bollywood movie you saw in college, let me put it this way. Tollywood is like Bollywood, but more. The action is bigger, the musical numbers go way harder, and the stars are revered. At least as far as I can gather from the totally bonkers response to the RRR trailer being released in Indian theaters.
भाई यार ओ अपन क्या क्रेज बहुत है हॉलीवुड पिक्चरों को इज्जत मिलती है भाई यार ये
Now let's see a Marvel movie top that. You might have experienced this yourself if you managed to watch RRR in a theater full of Telugu-speaking viewers like I did. And let me just say, after that experience, I really need to learn how to wolf whistle if I'm going to do that again. But also, what makes something like this unique for me as an American viewer is that I'm only used to these big vocal audience reactions happening with franchises like Marvel or Star Wars. RRR is not based on any existing IP. It's an original movie, but my opening night crowds cheered as soon as the main characters made their entrance, and then a whole bunch of times after that. And that's because in a lot of major Indian industries, the stars are the franchise, the way it used to be in Hollywood. Like, we all know Robert Downey Jr. is a huge movie star, but can you imagine people cheering when he shows up in, like, The Judge?
नहीं चिल्लाने वाले नहीं चिल्लाने वाले
No, of course not. But a big part of why audiences were so amped for RRR is because it brought together two of Tollywood's biggest stars, who, at least according to them, have never done a movie together before because no production could afford them both. During RRR's end credits musical number, which by the way is spectacular and something that every movie should have, at one point a middle-aged man shows up who was not actually in the movie itself, and my audience went nuts, whistling and cheering for this guy. I looked it up when I got home and discovered that that was the director, S.S. Rajamouli. People reacted to the director's cameo like he was Tobey Maguire showing up in No Way Home. Because remember, in the past decade, with his films Bahubali the Beginning and Bahubali 2 the Conclusion, this guy had become India's most popular filmmaker. To really illustrate how big a deal these people are, let's talk about the title. RRR stands for Rise, Roar, Revolt in English, and a number of similar things in the many Indian languages it was released in. But those slogans were all reverse engineered because RRR was actually the film's working title when it was announced back in 2018. It stood for Ram Charan, Ramarao Jr., and Rajamali. Three names so huge in Tollywood that they just decided to stick with it and name the movie after them. This is like if The Post was called Streep Hanks Spielberg. Okay, so now that we've established why this movie is such a big deal, what is it actually about? Well, RRR is a historical epic set in 1920s British-controlled India about two real people who fought against colonial rule, Alluri Sitaram Raju and Komaram Bhim. Now, in reality, these men never met, but what this movie presupposes is maybe they did? And maybe they became best friends? Pretty much nothing in the movie is based on fact except for the names of the two revolutionaries and a few other minor details. So this is basically historical fan fiction. But Rajamali and his story writer, who happens to be his dad, decided it would be fun to write something set in the brief period of history where the two men's whereabouts were mostly unknown. It tells the story of two super strong, muscular hunks who become best friends without realizing they're on opposing sides, since Ram is working for the British and Bhim is fighting against them. This, of course, eventually leads to an explosive falling out. So it's kind of like the inevitable explosion of the mega powers, Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage. I don't actually get that reference because I don't watch wrestling, but the co-writer told me to say it. Anyway, minor spoilers, but they finally realize they're on the same side and team up to open a can of whoop-ass on the British Empire. That was another wrestling reference, wasn't it? So after all this hype, especially after the movie was delayed for nearly 2 full years thanks to the pandemic, it might seem impossible that RRR could actually deliver. And yet, it absolutely 100% completely does. And to be clear, the reason that I'm a fan of RRR is not because it's so wacky and crazy like the usual ways people describe Indian movies. I'm a fan because it rules. Like, it is actually a great movie, and I love it. See, when you talk to people here who have seen RRR, we tend to say things like this.
The best movie I've ever seen. After watching this movie, I felt like I could walk through a brick.
अच्छा हाँ हॉलीवुड की क्रिटिक
but I assume it feels like the experience of watching
हॉलीवुड की
I
क्रिटिक
have found religion, and it is RRR.
And you might think we're being a bit over the top and hyperbolic. But the thing is, RRR is an over-the-top hyperbolic movie, and it invites this kind of response. Like I said earlier, Tollywood is like Bollywood, but more. Everything in this movie is cranked to 11. Wait, no, scratch that. 13. There is zero room for subtlety. Everything is as big and dramatic as it can possibly be. When Bhim and Ram become friends, they become the best friends in the world, and they hang out doing squats while sitting on each other's shoulders. They are the strongest men in the world. The evil racist villains are the most evil and the most racist. A musical number isn't just a regular song and dance. Here, it is a furious dance battle against colonialism that is so intense it shakes the earth. When one of the heroes is captured and publicly flogged, they beat him with a whip covered in metal spikes, and during this, he sings a song so inspiring that it leads the crowd to riot. Okay, let's back up. The movie itself begins with 3 chapters. In the first, we see a young Indian girl named Mali being taken from her village tribe by the evil British governor while her mother is beaten over the head with a tree branch. In the next chapter, we meet Ram, who is working as a policeman for the British Crown, and he is introduced fighting 200 men at the same time, all by himself. Then in the next chapter, we're introduced to Bhim, wearing a loincloth in the forest, fighting a wolf and a tiger with his bare hands. He is on a mission to rescue Mali. And then these two heroes, without realizing they're actually working against each other, end up meeting while they use their incredible abilities to rescue a kid from an exploding bridge, and this all happens before the title card appears 40 minutes in. So what I'm saying is, if you enjoyed Drive My Car, this is pretty much the same thing, but with a few more backflips and drop kicks. And later on, when the movie has its intermission, because most Indian movies have intermissions, or intervals as they're often called, even though the movies don't actually stop here when they're playing in the US, it feels like the biggest, most epic intermission of all time, with a bloody teardrop that practically burns the intermission title card onto the screen. Only instead of saying interval, it says interval. In American cinema, irony, snark, and self-awareness have become defining characteristics of modern blockbusters. I talked in the last video about how the movie star personas of Ryan Reynolds and Dwayne Johnson are largely built around winking at the audience, as if to say, "Isn't it funny that I'm in this movie? Don't worry, it's all gonna be fine. Don't take it too seriously. I'm Deadpool." The leads of RRR might also be huge, jacked men, not to be confused with Hugh Jackman, but this movie doesn't wink once. No one is tossing one-liners comparing the villains to characters from 80s movies or making fun of their names.
Dr. Otto Octavius.
And this is not to say that the movie is dour and glum. It's not. I mean, there's a 20-minute stretch where it fully turns into a delightful romantic comedy. The thing about RRR is that it is sincere. This is a movie fully on the wavelength of Dominic Toretto. It believes in itself and it isn't afraid of being corny. But instead of being all about family, it's all about the power of friendship. It is super melodramatic. Characters are constantly pledging their lives to missions or saying things like, "I have your friendship, which is more important than my life." And what makes it all work is that the whole story is built on this rock-solid emotional core, where the stakes are always clear. Will Beam rescue Molly? Will Beam and Ram's friendship survive? And of course, the root of all these problems, the true evil looming over everything, is colonialism and the British Empire, represented by the cartoonishly evil governor, played by the Punisher himself, Ray Stevenson, and his sadistic wife, played by Alison Doody, you know, the blonde Nazi woman from Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. Rajamouli's Bahubali films felt like an updated version of classic Hollywood biblical epics. Swords and sandals movies with fantastical elements told as if they were Hindu mythology. And even though RRR is set in the 20th century and involves some real history, he takes a similarly mythic approach to the storytelling. They don't need to give physical explanations for why the good guys have superhuman strength. These are legendary heroes, that's just how it is. In the third act of the movie, Ram even has this makeover, modeling his whole appearance, the colors of his clothing, and his choice of weapons on the
Thank God इसको समझ में आया भाई किसी ने help की. Thank God.
The mythological vibe of this movie is this device that RRR uses repeatedly. During a scene, it will play a song with lyrics describing and commenting on the story, essentially functioning like a Greek chorus. During the montage of Beam and Ram becoming best friends, a song called Dosti plays, where the lyrics translate to this: "An unforeseen turn of fate, which has culminated in this friendship. It's yet to be seen if it will end in bloodshed. A friendship between a volcano and a storm. Once the veil is lifted, will there be a destructive war?" This is grand, operatic stuff. And in the climactic action set piece, when the heroes are kicking ass and taking on an entire army by themselves, the soundtrack plays a song where all the lyrics are about how amazing and awesome they are as they take on the roles of specific characters in Hindu mythology. And hey, Taika Waititi, if you're watching this, you've still got a few months left to add something like this into the new Thor movie. Think about it. A song about how cool and charming Thor is while he's beating up frost giants. People would love it.
कभी नहीं कर पाएगा.
His name is Thor.
भाई टाका वाइटिटी कभी नहीं कर पाएगा.
Is this the best movie of the year? Because look, all of their movies this year have a lot to live up to after this. And not just action movies. RRR, like many Indian blockbusters, is kind of like 3 movies in one, and they all rule. First up, action. The action in RRR is kind of a mix between 90s John Woo and Zack Snyder if he was actually having fun and wasn't being so serious. It's full of slow motion and speed ramping, emphasizing the superheroic poses and impossible strength of the heroes, and it's shot with total clarity. You can see everything, and even though it's assisted with CGI, there's always a weight to it, and it never turns into a bunch of gray sludge like so many American blockbusters. And most of all, the action is inventive and hilarious and shockingly bloody. Like, this mostly PG movie pivots hard into R-rated territory whenever an action scene kicks in.
नहीं,
And
ये तो
suddenly
बहुत
the heroes
खून था,
are
बहुत खून।
throwing leopards at bad guys who then get their throats ripped out by said leopards. And the final set piece is the most exhilarating, righteous ass-kicking I've seen since, like, the Knife Museum in John Wick 3. It is already a good year for action. Like, Ambulance rules. But for now, RRR, best action movie of the year. And it's also the best musical. RRR understands what seemingly no Hollywood movie aside from Spielberg's West Side Story has understood in years. That pretty much nothing in cinema is as exciting as holding on a wide shot while amazing dancers perform spectacular choreography.
Do you know? Natu?
यही चीज तो नहीं कर पाता हॉलीवुड, इसी बात का प्राउड है।
Natu is an absolute banger of a song that I listen to approximately 5 times a day. The scene tells an entire incredibly entertaining story with the heroes facing off against this shitty, villainous British snob who looks like Ben Wishaw's mean older brother and thinks he is the best dancer around. But the important thing about it is that every time the characters dance, the scene cuts to a shot like this. A wide shot where we can see the performers' entire bodies. And it doesn't cut until that part of the dance is done. Months before RRR opened, the studio released a brief 10-second clip of the dancing in the Natu Natu sequence, and it became a viral sensation with so many tutorial videos on YouTube that I lost count. And all just for a 10-second clip of the dance. So when the movie finally opened and the Natu Natu sequence kicked in, audiences reacted like this.
अबे बहुत हल्ला हो रही थी भाई, बहुत हल्ला था, मैं पर्सनली एंजॉय कर रहा था मैं अभी। भाई क्या मार्वल बनेगा रे, तू देख ऐसी फैन फॉलोइंग चाहिए तेरे को।
Like, some people even showed up and performed the dance along with the movie in the theater.
भाई ये बड़ा फेमस है।
Anyway, song of the year, give it the Oscar right now. It's the best. And you know what? I'm gonna go further. RRR is also the best romantic comedy of 2022. I'll admit the movie only really spends 20 of its 188 minutes in rom-com mode, but it is such a fun part of the movie. Beam is trying to figure out how to get inside the British mansion where Molly, the little girl, is being held prisoner, and then he encounters Jenny, the governor's niece, and the only nice white person in the entire movie. And he's immediately crushing hard. So then we have a meet cute and these funny scenes where they hang out and try to communicate despite not speaking each other's languages. And you know how romantic comedies always have that inevitable third act misunderstanding that forces the couple to temporarily break up? Well, this has one of those too. Except in RRR, it's because Beam crashes a truck into a party at Jenny's home and lights the place on fire while attacking it with an army of wild animals that kill half the guests. Like I said, best romantic comedy of the year.
Slightly more serious note.
Going into RRR,
dark
there's
okay.
obviously a lot of context I was missing, both historically and for the religious imagery used throughout the film. Obviously, though, it still slaps if you know nothing about that stuff. As I mentioned before, I'm not really familiar with Indian cinema or especially Indian politics, so watching RRR was actually a pretty interesting gateway, especially when I heard some of the criticisms that people have of the movie. Some folks in India have even been calling it propaganda, and while I'm not really qualified to go that far, the reasons for this can offer a window into some wider conversations. I mentioned earlier that Ram's awesome costume change near the end of the movie is meant to resemble the appearance of Lord Ram, a key heroic figure in Hindu scriptures. The specific shade of orange he wears, saffron orange, has deep ties to Hinduism. There are a bunch of references to Hindu mythology that totally went over my head, but they're scattered throughout RRR, and it's what helps the movie feel like this big religious epic. But this is also where some of the criticisms stem from, because that kind of imagery doesn't exist in a vacuum. Now, for this next part, if you want to yell at someone, feel free to yell at my Indian co-writer, because I'm coming at this as an outsider, especially when it comes to issues that deal with caste and tribes. But a movie that takes real people who fought real revolutions for real reasons, like protecting forest lands and tribal communities, and turns them into superheroes in the vein of Hindu gods, it's bound to ruffle a few feathers. For some, it's probably because of the historical inaccuracies, but a movie like RRR isn't really concerned with that, so I'm not sure that matters. But for others, it's because of the state of Indian politics over the last few years, and its major shift towards right-wing Hindu nationalism that targets Muslims and tribal and lower caste communities. That right-wing nationalism is something a lot of big Indian cinema seems to be leaning into as well, especially in Bollywood. The color that represents that right-wing movement is also saffron orange, so you can't really separate the movie from the wider Indian politics when the connection is that overt, whether or not it's intentional. I mean, what you see in the movie is still an amazing spectacle because it leads to some of the most innovative, fist-pumping, fuck-yeah violence I've ever seen on screen, and it's all directed towards the British Empire, which is great. 3 words: grenade-tipped arrows. But I get where people are coming from. So if nothing else, a movie like this one is a way to dip your toe into another culture's cinema while also learning where exactly it fits within that culture. This is just one of the many things that makes RRR such a fascinating experience. Even though aspects of RRR feel very modern, like the stylized, CGI-assisted speed-ramping action, the movie itself feels like the kind of Hollywood movie that hasn't existed in decades. It's a big action blockbuster, but it's not based on any intellectual property, and it has no aspirations of becoming a franchise or setting up a spin-off streaming show. It is a historical epic whose major draws are its 2 stars and its director. If anything, this feels like a throwback to the golden age of Hollywood and movies like Ben-Hur or Gone with the Wind. When the audience is going nuts, whistling and cheering at the screen, it's not because of surprise cameos by characters from other movies. It's because they are so invested in this film. And you know what? I'm just gonna say it. More than any movie I have seen recently, this is the one that lives up to Nicole Kidman's promise in the AMC promo video.
Come to this place for magic.
ओए मैंने देखा
Come
था
to AMC theaters to
मैंने
laugh,
देखा था
to cry.
अरे यार हमको पैसा बढ़ा दिए थे बैटमैन के लिए
Not just entertained, but somehow
ओ
reborn.
भाई
Dazzling images on a huge silver screen. Our heroes feel like the best part of us, and stories feel perfect and powerful.
Because when you're watching RRR, they are. RR. So RRR is a pretty great first step into Indian cinema. But what about your next step? And I know this can get overwhelming since Indian cinema is such a massive thing. Like, remember all those different film industries we mentioned earlier that all exist within one country? Well, don't worry, I can help. See, this video is brought to you by Mubi, one of my favorite streaming services. And the whole point of Mubi is to curate a selection of great films from around the world. And you can search by country and do a deep dive into Indian cinema, from 1950s Bollywood classics like Avara or The Vagabond and Devdas, to Satyajit Ray classics from 1960s, to modern action movies. Plus some of the Indian art house movies my co-writer Siddhant recommends, like Anhe Gore Dadan and Omdar Bidar. Plus, Mubi has what's called Notebook, their own online film magazine, which currently has a huge feature article all about RRR, which is
Business is
absolutely
important.
worth reading. But beyond just Indian films, Mubi has so much great stuff. They premiere a new movie every day, and it's all hand-selected, basically like a streamable film festival. Okay, I'm just gonna scroll through here and just look at what they've got right now. So some recent films of the day are Journey to the West from Stephen Chow, director of Kung Fu Hustle, Alex Ross Perry's Listen Up Philip, Army of Shadows from Jean-Pierre Melville, one of my favorite French directors. Oh, they've got Battle Royale. Everyone loves Battle Royale. They have classics like Jean Renoir's Grande Illusion, Buster Keaton's The General, Mel Brooks' The Producers, more recent movies like the Safdie brothers' Heaven Knows What, or Terrence Malick's Voyage of Time documentary, which is just weirdly hard to find anywhere, so that's cool. Oh, they have a bunch of Dario Argento movies, like Inferno
Oscar bhai?
and Opera.
क्या
Opera
brand कितना
rules.
काम कराएगा
Seriously.
इससे?
Please sign up for Movie and watch Opera. I'm sorry this is going on so long, but they also have Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark, which I don't know why is so hard to find. Like, the Blu-ray is out of print, you can't rent it anywhere, it's not streaming anywhere else, and it's fantastic. It's incredible. You gotta see Near Dark. Okay, sorry, I could do this all day. Mubi is great, their collection is incredible, and it's curated by people with extremely good taste. And right now, you can get 30 days totally free at Mubi.com/Patrick H. Willems. That is MUBI.com/Patrick H. Willems. Roll credits.
ओह, अच्छा वो खत्म ही हो गया था। बहुत पसंद आया। जहाँ बात रही इसके जब सीरियस टोन में आ गया था, ख्याल से पता नहीं उससे मुझे एग्री करना चाहिए कि नहीं करना चाहिए। आई डोंट नो अबाउट दैट, मतलब कि मैं उसके बारे में ज़्यादा सोचना नहीं चाहता, मगर अपार्ट फ्रॉम ऑल ऑफ दिस, ये मैं इसे कह सकता हूँ, ये वीडियो पूरी आधे घंटे की रिव्यू था पूरी पिक्चर का, क्योंकि मूवी सीरियसली अच्छी है। हाँ, जान रहे हैं उसमें कुछ कमियां हैं, जो ऑब्वियस कमियां हैं, जैसे बोला पैट्रिक ने कि भाई मूवी डजंट गिव अ एफ अबाउट ऑल दोज ग्रेविटी डिफाइंग स्टंट्स, और भाई जो भी डायलॉग्स थे एग्जैजरेटेड वाले, क्योंकि भाई बोल जैसे बोला फक या भाई, ऐसा अपन ने एक्शन देखा, ऐसे अपन ने क्या इन्वेंटिव चीजें देखी जो पहले कभी नहीं हुई। और मैं सीरियसली बहुत दिल से एडमायर करता हूँ कि भाई बंदे ने एटलीस्ट इसे एक बार देखा और लोगों को भी दिखाया, और लोग भी इसे देखने जरूर जाने चाहिए। पैट्रिक एच विलियम्स को जरूर चेकआउट करना, क्योंकि पर्सनली ये मेरा अनकहा मेंटर रहा है, कि मतलब ये जान नहीं रहा है लेकिन मैंने इससे कई सारी चीजें सीखी हैं। तो हाँ, जरूर जाके देखना। और भी कोई वीडियोस हो तो उसके बारे में मुझे जरूर बताना कमेंट्स में, देखेंगे उसको भी।